Good morning, and thanks very much for having me over. I feel really honored and also humbled to be here in front of this amazing crowd of people. In some ways, I'm the bad cop this morning because, the theme of this session is rebalance. And, Shahidul gave you an aspect of that, which is, let's hear the voice of the majority world, which all of you are, really happy and feels really good to hear that kind of thing. And then Anand gave this, talk about, very inspiring talk, moving talk about how India is rising, the revolution of rising aspirations, the American dream coming true in India. So that's the good news, because all of you, let's face it, are very, very happy to hear this kind of thing. But I'm the bad guy because I want to, give you a little bit some of the more less kind of comfortable aspects of this rebalance theme, because it's going to make Americans in particular, a little bit, we want to shift in your seats a little bit, make you a little bit uncomfortable, because this is about the United States possibly losing its kind of top dog status. So it's good to hear, the other is rising. Not so good to hear that, that means that we're going to be displaced from our #1 status. So here's this is the cover of my book, and it's meant to capture, the bad news, as it were, that, the eclipse is happening. So it's a story about dominance and the shift in power. And, as an Indian, this dominance theme is kind of close to our heart, because I remember 30 years ago when my wife and I first came to England, we were watching this movie program, and, it's a kind of comedy program, and there was Prince Charles, pacing the room back and forth in this really anxious, fretful manner, and a pregnant Diana is sitting next to him and saying, darling, what's the matter? Why are you so worried? What's the matter? And he says, darling, I want to give my children all the things that I never had. And she says, darling, what could that possibly be? And he says, India, for example. And we know that that ain't going to happen in the near future. If these stories are now told in China, I think one would be a little bit more careful about this. But essentially, this is a story about the shifting dominance, the superpower transition from the United States to China. Now, what is the motivation for this book? Larry Summers, the brilliant Larry Summers, president of Harvard, President Obama's chief economic advisor, and just a giant of an intellect. As he left the White House, what he said was that, yes, China is arriving on the scene. Yes, China is very powerful. But all this talk about, China eclipsing us, ain't going to happen. They said that about Japan in the 80s, about Russia in the 50s. But really, if we get our act together, there's no way that the United States can be eclipsed. And in some ways, my book challenges this Central American conceit. And in fact, I opened my book. So I don't know how many of you know this picture. It's a picture in 1998. This is Michel Condessou, who was then the managing director of the IMF. And that's President Suharto. We had this great global crisis in Asia, and many Asian countries were in financial trouble. They needed money. So what did they do? They went to the International Monetary Fund for help. And of course, the IMF still is, but then even more so, was really an instrument of Western power. And so Michel Condessou kind of symbolized this strength of the West. And you see this picture. And this has been, relayed all over Asia many, many times. And it's become a kind of symbol of Western dominance of Asia. There you have Michel Condessou standing somewhat smug, hands folded, while President Suharto is actually signing the terms of the agreement with the IMF, in which the IMF lays down all the things that Indonesia has to do. So it's really a sign of it's a symbol of humiliation, a kind of a giving away of national sovereignty. And this is an image that resonates very, very strongly all over Asia. But my book, in fact, begins with this fantasy scenario where, in fact, the roles are reversed. And in fact, the American president, as I open my book, goes to the International Monetary Fund. This is 2021. The managing director is a Chinese gentleman. and the US is in great fiscal trouble, it needs money, and then China, the IMF, similarly prescribes all the things that the United States will have to do, and it's really a very, very kind of humiliating situation for China, for the US, symbolizing the kind of transition from the US to China in terms of the whole geopolitical game. So that's the way I begin my book, just to kind of provoke, to kind of shake this sense of complacency, even hubris that I find still exists, as was expressed in that quote of Larry Summers. And that's how my book is about. That's what my book is about. And so the main messages of my book are the following. It's based on some very boring pedestrian economic analysis. Essentially that China's economic dominance is more imminent in time, going to be much broader in scope, and much greater in magnitude than anyone currently imagines. And I'll show you a chart on that. And one of the things I've kind of foolishly predicted based on my book is that by 2020, the renminbi, the Chinese currency, will actually eclipse the dollar as the world's #1 currency. So in fact, one of the sponsors of PopTech is The Economist. So 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago, there was an online Oxford-style debate between me and someone with me, carrying forward this proposition that the dollar will be eclipsed in 10 years. So there was a big debate, people chimed in, and at the end they have a vote. Do you believe Arvind Subramanian's claim, or do you believe someone else's? And I lost comprehensively. 75% of the audience thought that, no way that the Chinese currency will eclipse the dollar. But I actually do really believe, if you look at all the things that are happening in Asia, in Africa, central bank after central bank, traders and more traders are actually trading in the Chinese currency more and more. And I do believe that symbol of US dominance, the dollar, is in for some challenging times over the next 10 years or so. So that's kind of the main message of my book. And then I work through what the implications of this are, for the international economic system and for the United States. And one kind of theme that I develop in the book based on historical experience is that the United States is really very vulnerable because it's become so weak, and I'll explain that in a second, that really I think there needs to be a greater sense of urgency if some of these trends have to be kind of arrested, as it were. But let me show you what I mean by, So what I do in this book is that I construct a simple index of dominance, which, combines a country's GDP, trade, and its external financial strength. And I kind of, assess this going back. And you can see that in 1870, the United Kingdom was the world's, most powerful nation. And you can see that in the post-World War period, actually, it's the US that had top dog status. But if you run the numbers for 2010, for example, it turns out now that China and the US are on par. And in fact, in some ways, I think Chinese dominance, economic dominance, is here upon us already. So when people read my book, their comment is that oh yeah, this is going to happen, but 10, 15 years from now, it's not going to happen as soon as I'm predicting. And my answer is that it's already here. It's already here, and you see many, many manifestations of that. For example, if you go to Africa, for example, where China has made a lot of investments, there are no Taiwanese embassies left in Africa, because that's the quid pro quo that China has demanded for its greater investments in China. A second manifestation, God forbid something were to happen in Europe and the Eurozone were to disintegrate, and if the European countries, even some of the big ones like Italy, perhaps even France, were to need money, where would the world turn to? It wouldn't turn to the United States. The United States is kind of semi-bankrupt itself. We wouldn't turn to India. We wouldn't turn to Russia or Brazil. We would all turn to cash-rich China. And China really controls the finance spigots of the world. So that's another sign, maybe in the next 1 year, we will see manifestations of that. So in a number of ways, we see Chinese dominance upon us already. And that's the sense in which I say that dominance is much more imminent than many people believe or imagine. The second point I want to make is that, it's much greater in magnitude than anyone currently imagines. If you look at, I project the numbers down to 2030 under some very, very conservative assumptions. I'm not rigging these numbers in my favor to make my point. And if you look at 2030, this kind of skyscraper shantytown, image, this metaphor of dominance, as it were, this kind of building metaphor, China relative to its nearest competitors looks very similar to the United States and its competitors, in the mid 70s, and comparable to the status that the United Kingdom had, Great Britain had at the time in the great days of empire. So, in a sense, what is striking about this is that we are not talking about a world of the G7. The G7 is history. We now have the G20, but this says we're not even talking about G20. We're not even talking about G2 with the US and China as equals. We're really talking about possibly a G1, in which the one, unfortunately, for Americans, is no longer the United States, and a G1 with China could be kind of, ruling the world. So I think this is the reality that I think we all need to get used to and get adjusted to, and it has all kinds of implications for, for the US, for India, for other emerging market countries, and indeed for how we run the world. So I want to, take you through a couple of these. One is the implication for the United States itself. Now, I don't know how many of you are his history buffs. In 1956, at the time of the previous superpower transition from the UK to the US, what happened was that the United Kingdom, along with France and Israel, invaded the Suez Canal zone in 1956. And President Eisenhower was very unhappy with that because that action was taken without his knowledge, certainly not his blessing. And then, but due to a combination of circumstances, the British economy came under pressure. And the British economy came under pressure. They needed money. And Britain thought it had a special relationship with the United States. So it turned to the US for help. And President Eisenhower basically said, unless you withdraw immediately from the Suez Canal right now, you will not only get our money, American money, we will not even let you withdraw your own money that's there at the IMF. And in a sense, it was a very credible threat because the United Kingdom had become very weak. And that's the sense in which, and then the UK had to comply immediately and withdrew its forces from the Suez Canal zone. Now, I see a similar parallel now, between that transition, the US-UK transition, and the US-China transition, in the following sense. At that time, the UK was also a debtor, as the US is now. But the parallel is much, much broader and much deeper. We think of the United States now as kind of going through a downturn. Yes, there's high unemployment. The fiscal situation is not very bright. It's a bit grim. The growth prospects in the US, unlike in India, for example, also look pretty dire. But I think the other dimension of weakness in the United States is what I call the beleaguered middle class problem. Median wages are stagnating, income distribution is rising, and some of the protests that you see down on Wall Street reflect this general, lack of comfort with broader developments in the US. The middle class is getting squeezed, mobility is declining. In a sense, the complete opposite of what Anand was describing is happening in India. Now, Larry Katz, who's a Harvard professor, captures this very well when he says, the US is like an apartment block that once upon a time used to be the envy of the neighborhood. Today, the penthouses are getting bigger and bigger. The middle floors are getting squeezed. The basement is flooded. And above all, the elevator from the basement is broken down. So that's the sense in which there is generalized economic weakness. And like in 1956, we now have a credible international competitor that's emerged. And let me remind you, this credible competitor, China, will by 2030 have a 50% larger economy than the United States, 50% more trade. It will continue to control the financial spigots of the world, and it will perhaps be issuing the world's #1 currency. So that's the sense in which this is very much like that transition. So the period of transition that Andrew spoke about is very much upon us, and we all need to get used to this. Now, I want to just step back and then conclude by drawing some, I think, broader parallels that stem from this theme of rebalancing. Remember, this is the most dramatic manifestation of the shift of the transition, the rebalancing of, the whole economic and geopolitical weight from what Fareed Zakaria calls from the West to the rest. And the China-US thing is kind of stark illustration of that. But I think it has many, many broader implications for lots of things. So let me try and sketch out 3 implications of this broader rebalancing that we're speaking about. First and foremost, I think, perhaps more mundanely, I think at PopTech we need to see many, many more Chinese faces than we do. If not, it's not going to reflect the world that I certainly believe we're seeing and we're going to see over the next 10, 20 years. So that's the first manifestation, the first implication, mundane for PopTech. But there are 2, I think, much broader implications. One is about how we cooperate internationally. I think that has to just change dramatically. If you think, for example, about global warming and climate change, and the Kyoto Protocol and what happened in Copenhagen and Cancun, I think there is a sense in which that whole cooperative framework has not adjusted to the new reality, because that cooperative framework is still based on, the rich world is going to set the agenda. We need taxes and emissions reductions all over the world. We kind of go around the world saying, please, China, India, go ahead and do these things, and in return, you will get some carrots and sticks. That world is gone because the West, the United States, and Europe no longer have the carrots and sticks to either bully or cajole the others to cooperate. It's a different world altogether. The whole climate change conversation has to change dramatically, where China and India are kind of as much agenda setting, as much talking about what they should do themselves and what they expect the others to do. So that has to change very, very dramatically. And that's just one illustration of what's going on. Similarly, in the Doha round of trade negotiations, it can no longer be about what America wants, what kind of market opening America or Europe want China and India to do. It's going to be much more symmetric and much more balanced. So that's one implication, and this applies to broader areas of cooperation as well. But the last implication which I want to leave you with is the following, is that when we talk about rebalancing, we talk about a world of globalization. It's a cliche of our times that the world has become much more globalized, and that's absolutely true. If you look at the trade flows, the flows of finance, the flows of, you name it, they have increased cross-border. But the thought I want to leave you with is that what is distinctive about this new world that we're in is not just that there's more globalization, but what I call there's much more crisscrossing globalization. Think of the world, we think of the world, or we used to think of the world as where, the West used to produce the ideas, the technology, the capital, the management talent, and the poor world, the majority world, to use Shahidul's phrase, would provide the cheap labor and the resources. That's gone. It's completely gone, because take foreign direct investment, for example. India and China are investing as much overseas as these countries are investing in India and China. And in a number of ways, we see ideas, goods, technology, crossing, moving both sides. And that's, I think, what is terribly exciting and challenging, because it creates great strengths and great opportunities, not least the fact that, if you remember, after the financial crisis, when trade collapsed, much more than after the Great Depression, we thought that there would be an upsurge of protectionism. But that didn't happen because these private sector trading relationships create an enmeshing of interests that, we no longer, protectionism no longer is kind of profitable or, worthwhile doing. So that's the positive dimension of this crisscrossing globalization. And I want to leave you with this, this crisscrossing globalization image or metaphor. Last winter, my family, we were in Kerala, taking a holiday, and there we came across this lady from California called Frida, and we were talking, got chatting with her, and basically what she said was that, I live in California, my pension has declined, I no longer can afford to live in California, so I have decided, to come and live in India, of course, the spiritual attraction is there, yoga and meditation, but also that, it's just a more economically viable place to live in. So think of this, in the future, that we think even about labor mobility as something that, poor people wanting to come to the West. But think of a world where it's quite possible in 5, 10, 15 years' time, especially if the economic malaise here continues, we have more and more rich people, people from rich countries, the West, for example, elderly people who want to live in countries like India and Guatemala and Mexico, and in return, the young and from all these countries come to live in the United States. So it's a world of crisscrossing globalization where all things are possible. And I want to end with this, a famous quote from John Maynard Keynes, who said, the inevitable never happens. It's the unexpected always. And that's what we're headed for in the future.